vaker te betaal omdat die nooit cloud gehad het. So dit gaan ek ook uitbring.
Okay, so welcome everyone to today's webinar on the Foundations of Self-Study. My name is Laura Kennedy. I am an assistant professor in the School of Education at Northern Michigan, and I am a web manager for the Self-Study SIG. I'm very excited to have you all with us. As you probably were just notified, we are recording the session. It will be posted onto the SIG's website afterwards. As we go through the webinar, we have a total of 4 papers to be presented, and then we'll open it up for a general Q&A, conversation, discussion of the topics. But as we're presenting through the papers, please use the chat window to record your questions. You can submit questions in the chat window at any time. I will be gathering them together, getting them organized, and putting them forth to our presenters when we get to that point in the webinar. And Eliza, do you have a few things to share with us about signing in?
Yes, I have put into the chat a link for the book drawing that we're going to be able to do that is provided by Springer, those wonderful people who support us. So please follow the link to the Google form and fill that out, so that we can announce a winner for the drawing at the end of the presentation.
Okay, I'm going to turn this over to Julian.
Well, hello everyone, I'm Julian Kitchen. I'm one of the editors of the International Handbook of Self-Study of Teaching and Teacher Education Practices. So we're delighted to have this webinar series of 6 on different sections of the handbook. I first want to thank Laura and Eliza for organizing our webinars. It's been a really great way to keep our community together during times when we have to stay physically apart. And it's a lot of work, a lot of logistics. So, I acknowledge on everyone's behalf the amazing work that they're doing. About 3 years ago, we decided that it was time to have another handbook. And it was a lot of work, but we're proud parents of a 7.4-pound baby. That's the weight of the handbook. 1,556 pages, 2 volumes, 54 chapters of amazing self-study work that hopefully will inform the field for the next 15 years the way that the last handbook has since 2004. So this week we have the first section, edited by Mandy Berry, and several of the authors of chapters are going to be sharing a little bit about their chapters with you today. And each month we will introduce a different section of the handbook and have several chapters highlighted for you. But the best way to discover the work is to actually look at the handbook either online through your university library or at hard copies, which will be coming out in the next little while. So welcome everybody. Thank you.
Thanks, Julian. That's a great start. Can I just mention too, if you haven't put your microphone on mute, to do that now. So my name's Mandy Berry and I'm a professor at Monash University in Melbourne, Australia. See my logo in the background, and I was thrilled and privileged to be a co-editor of this wonderful handbook as well. And today we're opening this webinar with part 1 and letting you know about some of the work that has been done within this chapter, and hopefully these chapters, and hopefully encouraging you to dive deeper into the world of self-study. Julie and I are also co-editors of the journal Studying Teacher Education, and so we encourage those who are watching now, if you haven't had a look at the journal, to do so, or if you're thinking about making a contribution, to contact us or to submit your paper, and maybe inspired by some of the things that you see today on the screen. So the Foundations of Self-Study, opening the handbook, is a way of looking back and looking forward about the work of the self-study group over time. So we examine through this part the processes, the principles, the practices, and for the first time even the policies that have been examined and have been explored through self-study. And you'll see there on your screen now the list of chapters that are part of this BASIS Foundations of Self-Study. The opening, standing on the threshold of an opportunity, is something that I have written based on what is in these wonderful chapters that helps us to reflect on where we are and where we can be going. And we know that self-study is now a well-established methodology within educational methodologies, but we also have great potential for expansion. And I think that the authors of these chapters help to remind us also of our history as well as where we can be taking this work. So you'll see there the different chapters in terms of looking back through the biennial Castle conferences, the theoretical roots of self-study research, how we are positioned in terms of identity and stance as researchers ourselves, the kinds of range of self-study, who does self-study and why they do it, a chapter on the notions of knowledge and what that means for practice and connections with self-study research, and as I mentioned before, about education policy. It was fantastic to work with this group of authors. This is a really fantastic collection of chapters, and each presenter today is going to give you some insights into their chapter. Obviously we can't do a lot in the time that we have, but they'll give you some snapshots of their work and some provocations for you to think further about the kinds of ideas that they'll be sharing. So our four presenters today, for 4 chapters today, tracing self-study research, theoretical roots, role of positioning identity, and who does self-study and why. So I'm very happy now to turn over to Dawn Garbutt, who will be presenting on behalf of her co-authors about the biennial Castle conferences and tracing of self-study research. Thanks, Dawn.
Thank you, and thank you for this opportunity to introduce our chapter in the International Handbook. I'd like to really thank you, Mandy, for being so patient with us and for coaxing me to get this over the line. I couldn't have done it without my co-authors, Linda and Lynn. Thank you enormously. This is a real joint effort. The 3 of us have been involved in the Castle conferences in numerous roles: as editors, authoring papers, reviewing, collaborating, presenting, participating, hosting and organising. We think we've just about done it all. And together we reread 700 papers from the first 12 Castle Conference proceedings. You can imagine how daunting that was, but ultimately it was a huge delight. There were so many gems and thought-provoking passages that resonated with us, and I really would recommend you go back and look at that treasure trove at your leisure. In this chapter, we have showcased the essence of the biennial conferences that we've come to know personally as the home of self-study research. And as you can see from the photo, it is a grand home. The special nature is the first theme that we address in the chapter. Perfect timing. Thank you, Laura. I also have to move on. So how did the Castle become home to self-study? We found the history of how this 15th century castle came to be the International Study Centre for Queen's University and home to the self-study SIG absolutely fascinating. Alfred Bader, a Czech Jew, was sent as a teenager to England to escape the Nazis. And 2 years later, he was sent on to Canada because he was suspected of being a 5th columnist, someone who might belong to a group who undermine a larger group from within. He went on to become a self-made millionaire and a philanthropist and donated the castle to his alma mater in 1996. The Bader's social vision has permeated the castle ever since then, and it's a theme that we turn to later in our chapter. But the first theme that emerged from our reading and rereading of the proceedings was how important the 4-day residential conference has been in nurturing and sustaining the fledgling community. It is quite unique in that we are given opportunity to argue, to critique, challenge, celebrate, and reassure one another in a safe and relaxing space. The luxury of time. Each session is just under an hour long. There are no keynote addresses and only 4 or 5 sessions run at the same time. The presenters are encouraged to engage their audiences in interactions, in discussions and collaborations. We know there is more to teaching than telling. Many of us have memories of writing haiku and poems, role-playing, collage making, dramatic performances, laughter and tears. The experience of attending this conference is rich beyond compare. As we found out, sadly, when we had to cancel the 13th Council Conference this year. How do you replace such a wonderful event? The Council Conference will always be remembered fondly for the convivial atmosphere of the pub. I shouldn't have said that, not on tape recording. But the English breakfast in the cafeteria and the banquet in the grand ballroom. There's always someone to share a conversation with, be they leading self-studiers and founding members of the community who have laid a foundation for collaboration and mentorship, or emerging researchers, students seeking to enhance their practice. In the chapter, we've made special mention of people who have attended the conferences since its inception. Tom Russell, John Loughran, Stephanie Pinnegar, and Deb Tidwell. But the contribution and generosity of other leading scholars has been immense. The castle is, without a doubt, our home away from home when we want to discuss self-study matters. So holding this community together with gossamer threads is this shared understanding that teaching about teaching is complex, challenging work, and researching your own practice is not for the faint-hearted. At the castle, we understand one another's trials and tribulations and share our professional vulnerability. We come together to learn from one another, and we do learn about everybody's challenges and issues. As we went through the Castle Conference proceedings and sessions, we've realised that the opportunity to discuss issues that concern us all as we continue to develop our understanding is at the forefront. How can we enhance our practices, understand ourselves, our workplaces, and our transitions through the academy? Our workplaces are so complex and dynamic. Our students challenge, confound, and surprise us at every turn. Themes of confronting racism, social injustice, bigotry, and privilege in our classrooms and in our institutions have been dominant in many self-studies. We anticipate that they will continue to be at the fore in future iterations. So the theme of celebrating diversity has been one that just came through for us as we read through the papers. The last theme that we looked at was, I guess it can be summed up by calling it the legitimization of self-study. And I have a quote there from Ardra Cole and Gary Knowles. They wrote that publishing research that is personal and practical is a threat to the reputation of the academy and challenges what counts as knowledge and research. They wrote that in one of the very first conference proceedings in 1996. And it's true, like fifth columnists, we have agitated for self-studies acceptance as a serious research discipline from within academia. We have claimed authority to speak about teaching and teacher education. It is what we do, what we know about, and what we research rigorously and systematically. To a great extent, we have quietened the critics, although we still struggle with having our research recognised as worthy for example, in promotion rounds and in funding applications. We've seen through successive conferences that there's been a definite nod towards increasing the scholarship of our work. For example, we've instigated a double-blind peer review process for proposals and conference papers. The acceptance rates of around 50% are deemed to be worthy statistics. It is a prestigious and rigorous conference. All of the proceedings have been digitised, and the last 4 have been made into edited books to increase accessibility and to make them count more substantially in the institutional assessment procedures. We wonder how the Castle Conference will look in the future. When we wrote our chapter, we hoped that self-study would continue to flourish and evolve. We know that we've traded off experimental methods and experiential learning when we've dictated a structured format, or when the format is reduced to something like this webinar with little interaction and engagement. No one anticipated having to cancel Castle 13. And will there be a Castle 14 in 2022? We hope so. We think that the Castle Conference is irreplaceable. We are resilient, we are self-studiers, we will find a way. And we hope that when you read this chapter, you will see how far we have come already. And who knows what the future brings. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Dawn. And yeah, what a massive task of going through all those Castle Conference proceedings, but I believe it was an enjoyable, massive task of doing that too. So thanks, that was really great way for us to get a feeling for both the history of the group as well as how the Castle has brought people together. And I really like that quote that you have from Cole and Knowles, because that's what we're continuing to try to do as a group, and the tensions that we experience between the ways in which the Academy works and the ways in which we know about teacher education practice and knowledge. So thanks. I think this is a terrific chapter, and I encourage everybody to read it. So now let me introduce to you our second presenters, Cheryl Craig and Gail Curtis, who are going to be taking us through a different door this time. Dawn and her colleagues took us through the door of the Castle, and Cheryl and Gail are taking us through the door of theory to think about the roots of self-study research. So thanks very much. I think I'm handing over to Cheryl here. And Dawn, if we could all clap, we would for your chapter. I think we could do it just virtually. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity for Gail and I to work on this theoretical roots of self-study research. And I could not have finished this project without Gail's help and leadership in working on this piece. You know, when we first started, when the invitation came, I was like, oh my goodness, how are we ever going to answer that question? And eventually it started to, eventually I realized that I was kind of lodged in the history of what was going on. And so we have it, I'm going to share the chapter overview, which is our next slide. And so what we did was we started to look at the theoretical roots of self-study. And what we did was, prior to that, we looked at conceptualizing the theory-practice relationship. We looked at a brief history of teacher ed. We did deep roots. And then we started to work into the Fenstermacher chapter, but then we retold it. And I think that's the most interesting part of our review. Basically, Fenstermacher repeated what Dewey did, the knower and the known, right? And Fenstermacher repeated it. He had these 4 major questions, and he chose the top personal knowledge, informal teacher knowledge groups in the world. And those were they were Tom Russell and Hugh Munby. They were Marilyn Cochrane Smith and Susan Lytle. They were Conley and Clendenin with Frema Albaz. And also at the beginning, Fenstermacher was part of it. But he took Fenstermacher out of the review because Fenstermacher's work was seen to cross formal knowledge and informal knowledge, or formal knowledge and practical knowledge. And so he spoke about each of these programs and what happened to them. But the basic thing for us is the fact of what happened after that that Fenstermacher's paper. If we were to retell it, what do we have? Well, we have Stephanie and Mary Lynn coming off of Fenstermacher and Virginia Richardson. We have Julian, who originally came off of Michael Conley, moved on to other people at the University of Toronto. We have Marilyn Cochrane-Smith and her colleagues. There are people from their group. We have people from Good Lads Center that are here as part of coming off of Dewey and kind of being partnered with others that come off of Dewey. And so we have all of these people, but I would like to point out one person, and that's Tom Russell. Because Tom, he had the Schoen line, and he didn't continue that line on where he was going, but he invested both feet in self-study, as did Stephanie, as did Mary Lynn, and others that did that as well. And so there is where we get the core, but these are all very close cousins. They're all meeting at the boundaries, right? They're all meeting and they're coming together. So if you look at the first handbook, you have chapters by Cochrane-Smith and Lytle, you have chapters by Jean Clendenin and such, you have lots with Tom Russell, and you have that there. But basically what we have going on there is, this is all based on the move from the behavioralism through process product research to multiple methods and qualitative research. All of that's going on. We're invested in the Invisible College. We've got, there's a parallel history there. We're invested in ISAT. There's a parallel history there. We have a parallel history with narrative inquiry and also with teacher research movement coming out of the UK. And we see Jack's work, and Jack famously tells us a story about presenting research in Britain as a teacher, and only one person attended his presentation, and he was kind of sad. But then it was Stenhouse. He had probably the most forward person in Britain at his presentation. So we have all of that going, and that all sits in our background, and that's how we kind of all fit together. And there's other things like I could add that the Australian people came in probably through Tom Russell, right? And there's various seed planters along the way that brought other people in. We have that little cluster coming in from from Stanford that Linda was a piece of, I think. There's a lot of going on. And then of course we've got Virginia Richardson students as well. And so all of these people fit together. And so this is this amazing blending of so many people, and so many people that interact with one and interact with another, and so forth. And so when I was checking on the lines, like for example with Tom Russell, everybody said, we in Canada we're all close cousins. There's no concern about one being ahead of the other or whatever. We're all very close in how we're doing things. So I had the good fortune of being at those meetings when everybody got along very, very well and advanced the field. There's one talk from Tom Russell. I asked him what happened, and he said, well, the Canadian, now Tom is an American citizen as well as a Canadian. I'm not sure what he is now. But he said, that the American system is so much more complex and convoluted because of it's much more politicized and so forth than Canada. So he said the Canadians didn't have as many entailments on their research, whereas what we see with, for example, the Schulman work, they were on the money stream from the federal government, right? So you have to produce some formal knowledge. So that's where you get in some little issues about whether you're formal or you're practical, because it was kind of like one foot in each camp. So I'm going to turn it over to Gail, and then I'll close out a bit.
And yeah, Laura, we'll go to the next slide. Thank you. So kind of going back to where Cheryl started, much like Dawn and her co-authors, we went back to all the Castle papers and reread those and looked at who are they citing? Who are all these people citing through the years, and what trends do we see? We had such a plethora of information. It was this huge pile. We really didn't know where to start. And so picking up on the Fenstermacher model and how that article was framed was really a wonderful starting point for us and helped us to kind of sort everything out. And in looking at all these, our family tree in self-study, and then along with those theoretical roots, we have what was happening in the field and the shifts that were occurring. So that's one of the things we examine is how these shifts kind of connect to legitimating self-study, but what all entailed. And so some of the changes or turns that occurred that we look at are the focus from expert knowledge to an emphasis on authority of practice and emphasis on theories related to the notion of personal practical knowing. And at the same time, there was this move away from generalizations to a focus on unique situations. And much of this was happening in the 60s through the 90s. And so as I came into education in the 90s, you know, I'm really seeing this live, so to speak, and seeing how it was impacting education and research. At the same time, there was a shift in the academy where it opened up a space to accept and promote alternate genres of research. And I think particularly important for those of us in schools in the 90s was this recognition of the flatness of numbers, which led to the acceptance of data of text as data, and a move away from this notion of one view fits all approach to interpreting the world, and moving more toward accepting multiple ways of capturing and making sense of human experience. And with that, this moving from an understanding of self in context to understanding how experiences of self in context really help to shift self-identity. And so looking forward to in self-study, we see how self-study has spread around the globe to include researchers from really all parts, recently Africa and South Africa. But we also see self-study researchers coming and bringing with them an array of epistemologies and ontologies. And so, Cheryl, I turn it back to you.
Yes, and you know, moving forward, we're not a copycat group of people at all. That there is tolerance for multiple ways of approaching issues. But you know, there's some people that are more postmodern than others, and so there's a huge gap. You know, there's going to be some matters about, you know, some people don't believe that you could observe someone because you would be interfering with what would be considered quote the data. You changed it by being in it. But so far we see that the community is being able to change and adapt as people work together. And so I just wanted, just before I end, I wanted to say something about Philip Jackson. And he was seen as sparring with Nate Gage, and Nate Gage was sort of the father of the behaviorist kind of approach to teaching and teacher education. At the end of his life, Philip Jackson, just before he died, came to AERA, and we asked him, you know, what do you see as we need move forward in terms of methodologies? Because remember, he had said in his book, we need every methodology that we could possibly have. We can't, there isn't enough methodologies to do what we do. And so we asked him, and he said, his answer was that people need to play themselves better. And so I think that's one of the things that we could say for self-study is how are we exploring to play ourselves better? And I think it really appeals to self-study. And I've got the cue and I'm done. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Cheryl and Gail. And yeah, imagine lots of hands clapping. We don't have that function in this format, but that was brilliant. And I think one of the things that came out of that chapter for me, which I absolutely loved, and I'm sure will be useful for so many people, that genealogy of ideas and people and connections. This is the most comprehensive chapter that I've seen in the way that you bring those together through the Fenstermacher ideas as well. So I heartily recommend this for everyone. I think you've done a fantastic job of pulling out the threads for the short amount of time that you have to present and helping us to understand some of the ways in which those ideas have developed and leaving us with some thoughts about how it might be positioned. So thank you very, very much. And that's a really nice transition into our next set of presenters, Stephanie and Derek, talking about positioning, identity and stance, which is all about S-STEP research. So thank you. I'm going to hand over to you now. I think Stephanie is kicking us off.
I'm going to start. So as Deleuze and Guattari argued, in any research, in any writing, each of us are always many. We thought of this as we worked together to explore positioning, identity, and stance. We began with ideas about the terms and what we thought needed or should be said. As often happens with us, these became a series of questions, and they organized this chapter. So next slide. Question 1. Why use the metaphor of becoming to make sense of our positioning, stance, and identity as S-STEP researchers? In 2013, Monica Taylor and Leslie Koya invited Mary Lynn and I to write a chapter in Gender, Feminism, and Queer Theory in the Self-Study of Teacher Education Practices. In our chapter, we presented interpretations and reinterpretations of our experiences during our early careers. In each reinterpretation of an image, Famous Man's Hall, from feminism, positioning theory, and then queer theory, we revealed how engaging in S-STEP work demands we establish trustworthiness of an account. And yet, because we work in a zone of maximal contact, our work, even when published, exists in a state of openness and inconclusivity. This is why we use the metaphor of becoming, as explained by Deleuze and Guattari, to make clear our positioning, stance, identity as S-STEP researchers, and for this community. We always are standing in a space of becoming, or perhaps because we stand in that space, we recognize that ideas and assertions about what counts and our understanding of what we know continues to evolve. Question 2, what does the action of naming ourselves as self-study of practice researchers mean? My great niece has Native American heritage, and one day when we were at the park, a group of children attempted to taunt her. They asserted she could not play with them because she was an Indian. She simply laughed, skipped over to join them, and inserted, "I'm not an Indian, I'm an Indian princess." Similar to the children in this story, other researchers use names to parse the research landscape, to sort, categorize, subjugate, and dismiss. When researchers apply demeaning labels and make false assertions about our work, we need to resist, noting these as strategies for othering, limiting our participation as scholars and undermining the value and contribution of our work. By asserting her identity as an Indian princess and simply joining in the play, my niece revealed the power that comes from naming ourselves. Malinowski asserted, naming brings things into existence. In naming ourselves, we enacted and brought into being a deliberately chosen vision of ourselves and the related behavior, appearance consistent with that vision. Go for it, Derek.
And before I begin, I'd just like to apologize if you hear background noise. My neighbor picked a fine time to mow the yard next door. So, how does a self-study of practice identity locate and position us within educational research, the educational research community, the teaching and teacher education research community, and within our research? We embrace a relational ontology which values diversity and difference, accepts incommensurability, and seeks to make space for and welcome this diversity into educational research. In a research community based in a modernist epistemology, researchers assert a single story of the research process, insisting on objectivity, validity, and generalizability. They position their subjects as static and knowable, seeing themselves as capable of randomizing and controlling variables that might cloud their findings. Self-study of practice studies of particular intractable problems allow us to articulate the intimate landscape, shape, and features of such problems. Tidwell and Fitzgerald's 2004 account of Tidwell's teaching of disengaged and disengaging students allows us to see more clearly issues of literacy development, disengagement from learning, and underestimation of student potential and relationship to persistent complexities of learning or cultural difference. Such studies value stories that reveal ourselves to ourselves and disrupt common understanding. Diversity threatens communities of research founded in modernist epistemology. Our methodology positions us differently within the landscape of educational research. We stand in practice and orient our research in a relational ontology focused on understanding what is. Slife argued that true community requires variability and some discord. He asserted that the most important task of those who embrace a relational ontology, like those of us in self-study of practice community, is to protect difference and otherness. How does self-study of practice identity position us within the teaching and teacher education research community? Based on the Zeichner paradox, our work holds the potential to disrupt knowledge of teaching, and I would say also restore knowledge of teaching and teacher education. Our inquiries occur in the everyday and travel between and hold in tension theory and practice. Kasper, Litschka, and Hillman examined their use of feedback in their pre-service teachers. In exploring empathy and feedback, they moved from work by Julian Kitchen on relational teacher education, examination of their feedback and their understanding of the term empathy, and articulate the influence of their increased understanding in their practice as teacher educators. Lynn Thomas produced a careful exploration of the ways in which her own location in the Office of Field Experiences reified the theory-practice divide. Like these studies, our work enables disruption of assemblages that attempt to reproduce dominant narratives of teacher education. This is the purview of our work within the conversation of research on teaching and teacher education. How are we positioned as self-study of practice researchers within our own work as teacher educators? Becoming self-study of practice researchers has consequences. Engaging in this research locates us in spaces of vulnerability, disruption, uncertainty, and relationship. We're radicals. As self-study of practice researchers, we continually to seek and to understand and improve the moments of our practice. We document our thinking, record our successes and our colossal failures. We collect information on our practices, our experiences, and the thinking of our students and others in our practice. We produce public accounts that represent the themes, patterns, and storylines that make clear the insights we share. As we explore the messiness of practice and confront ourselves with the fiascos of our difficulties, becoming self-study of practice researchers gives us confidence to act in both old and new ways. I would also like to add to this a thread that I heard in Don's presentation about rigor. And as someone who practices narrative inquiry primarily and who teaches qualitative research at the University of Kansas and reads lots of different qualitative research, as I started thinking with self-study theorists and practitioners, I started to recognize the ways that they position themselves, kind of harking back to Stephanie's story about her niece. They position themselves and they rename themselves in rigorous ways. The levels at which they think about and justify their work through literature and theory that really works to buttress their own reflection into their own practices in such meaningful and deep ways really repositions the work in the academic community as rigorous and as necessary to think about the practice of teaching and teacher education. So what's the research stance that we take up? Ethics is central to our ontological orientation and stance. In acting ethically, we must act with kindness and integrity. This means being honest in our accounts and holding ourselves accountable to enact the things we come to know. When practitioners are asked questions of practice, they respond, "It depends." Martin, in 2017 research, focused on her move to support pre-service teachers, learning to make them more capable of enacting the theory she taught in their practicum experiences. As she interrogated her practice, she came to understand how she needed to deeply listen to the voices of her students. Martin uncovered the complexity of "it depends" in standing between her course and field experiences. We seek to understand what exists and what we know in relationship to the particular and the specific context in our actions. We position ourselves in this way because uncovering our embodied knowing, our understanding of our practice behind our expression of "it depends," holds potential for contributing to and forming the research conversation in teacher education. Our research is and should be provocative and disrupt the stories of research and experience and to that of the academic context in which we find ourselves. We're vulnerable since we reveal fiascos, unproductive actions, and understanding. We invite others to critique our knowing and our practice. From this perspective, we embrace new knowledge and knowing. And as we do, we open new perspectives, new discourses, and new possibilities.
So the last question, what is our identity as teacher, educator, researchers in our inquiry? Do you want to move to the last slide? As STEP researchers, we bring a critical questioning approach to our work. We're willing to identify and explore fiascos and not just tell hero stories. Our openness and honesty mean knowing of ourselves is always disrupted. Our integrity means we act on the things we learn. Kitchen's work taught us that as we create educational theory and seek to enact it, our embodied knowledge of our living theory shifts and our identities shift, and we continue becoming. Telling is the dominant narrative of the academy. Kreitz might name this the sacred story. Clendenin asserted that when we live different narratives in everyday acts of teaching, the mundane, we can potentially shift the sacred story. We resist and struggle, studying our practice. We can shift this story and our identity as teacher educators. Through living and studying mundane stories, we articulate our actual practice. We form our identities as teacher educators in opposition to the sacred story, contribute to the conversation surrounding teacher education research, and develop new stories of teaching, teacher education, and research.
Thank you so much, Stephanie and Derek. Again, it's our virtual applause that it's very strong and proud of that work. That's excellent contribution again, as all of them are. And I think a really important reminder about the work being located in practice, but drawing way beyond practice, and that the complexities, situated, moral, relational aspects that go together to make self-study what it is, and that it can't be boxed in those same ways that maybe those impositions from outside in terms of expectations about what educational research should be pushes back against. I love that idea of protecting difference and otherness that you raised through this work. Thank you so much. So transitioning here now into our final presentation, and again, a reminder to everyone, put your comments and questions into the chat. We will come back to it. As each of our presenters has said, this is not the typical way in which self-study work comes out. It's a much more interactive process usually, but here in this format, we are restricted a little bit, but we're keen to interact with you after our final presentation. So Brandon and Angela have been doing a lot of work on figuring out who does self-study and why, and this is a really interesting chapter for pinpointing some of those ideas and pushing them further. So Brandon, welcome, and thanks. I'm handing over to you now.
Thank you, Mandy. Like Cheryl and Gail, when Mandy asked us to investigate this question, this was a question she sent us. We actually didn't even change the title of the chapter. There was a sense of trepidation because that's a very broad question. Who does self-study? Why do they do it? There's now 2 handbooks. There's a book series. We have the journal, the CASEL proceedings. People publish in disciplinary outlets. Self-study comes in many journals, nationally, internationally. So we had to create some boundaries for ourselves. And if you go to the next slide. So in interrogating that question, we wanted to look at 3 particular questions. So who conducts self-study research and where is it conducted? What are the professional self-understandings? We use Kelcherman's theories of professional self-understanding, self-image, self-esteem, job motivation, task perception, and future perspective. How do we apply those to the reasons for which researchers use self-study research? And in what practices of care, using Polkinghorne's theory, and thanks to Stephanie for helping us pinpoint on that one, is self-study research conducted? And also what limitations and possibilities exist for self-study research in those areas? Those are very broad questions to answer. So we felt it was best to focus in our attention. So Dawn and her colleagues looked at the CASEL proceedings. We really wanted to focus in on studying teacher education as just a journal. We thought that would provide a good boundary for our work, looking at from 2005 to 2017. In our few minutes here, we're going to focus in on the first and third question. So who conducts research, and also the practices of care. So we can go to the next one. So we reviewed all issues of studying teacher education from 2005 to 2017. We started writing a chapter in 2018, which is why we stopped in 2017 with the 2017 collection. So we found things that encouraged us, but also troubled us about the state of self-study and studying teacher education. The journal has been largely Anglo-centric, with a strong presence of specific scholars and institutions. So 3 countries, USA, Canada, and Australia, have accounted up until 2017 for a little over 82% of authors and 76% of institutional association. So it tells you that we're very westernized in terms of who's writing, who's conducting self-study, or at the very least, who is getting it published in studying teacher education, because you can find self-study research in various international outlets. There's some wonderful chapters that we talked about in later webinars about research conducted in many international settings. But when you look at the flagship journal, it's been very westernized. To that point, there had only been 17 countries represented in STE, and the big 5 were all Anglo-speaking countries. 4 and 5 were New Zealand and England. We also found that authorship was largely centralized by institution. So an example coming from the United States, 3 universities, Brigham Young, George Mason, and Montclair, accounted for just under 16% of all US authors in the journal, and almost 10% of all of the articles published in the journal. We found that there were many institutions that had a large number of publications done by the same person or people tied to different groups. There were large collectives. And that creates concern for us because whereas we can say there's a George Mason group with Anastasia, a Montclair group, a Kansas group, one of the questions we posed was what happens if one of those people retires? What if one of those people ends up leaving and moving to an institution? What happens to the state of self-study institutionally when we're so centralized in our self-study research collaboratives? Another example was a little over 61% of all Canadian contributions were tied to 5 universities, with the large majority of those coming from 2 institutions, Toronto and blanking on the other one all of a sudden. So positives in terms of who does self-study research that was publishing and self-study teacher education is truly a collaborative field. Self-study is inherently collaborative. We found a little over 2 authors per article published. And since 2009, that number has ticked up because articles were increasingly having 3, 4, 5 authors on a piece. So 14% of pieces published in the journal are 4 or more authors, and most of those have happened since 2009. We also found that there were 20 authors with 3 or more articles, which is also, again, problematic. So we have 20 authors accounting for 16% of publications. And we had 61 authors account for a third of all articles. So it tells you that, again, self-study teacher education as an outlet is very top-heavy in terms of who's publishing it. We have a small number of people publishing a lot in studying teacher ed. There were several hundred, a little over 200 people that published one time. They were on one piece in studying teacher ed. So that begs questions in terms of how do we increase our outreach and encourage others to publish in studying teacher education versus other vehicles. We do want to talk, we've talked in the field about encouraging the publication of self-study work in disciplinary journals, other journals related to teacher education, moving outside of teacher education, but also within studying teacher education, how do we diversify our authorship? That's started to change in the last few years. There's been a few other countries, institutions that are popping up, some new authors getting their voices heard in self-study. So that is an encouraging sign. So if we can go to the last slide. So Mandy asked us to tackle this question predominantly in the chapter of who are the others of self-study and how might we promote self-study further? And again, it's very difficult to think about all of the others that do self-study, considering you may find one individual person in a small disciplinary journal that's published self-study research. What were our boundaries? Were we going to look at engineering? We're looking at all the hard sciences, humanities, and in conversing with Stephanie, I was problematizing this with her at ARA in a self-study session, and she presented us the idea of practices of care authored by Polkinghorne. And he identified education as aligned with other practices of care. And so we sought out to look at 6 related fields, so 2 fields that were related in each set. So we looked at medical and nursing education, counseling and social work, and physical and occupational therapy. And so we have 3 subsections, one for each of those. And we also used Marilyn Hamilton's work from 2008 that looked at narrative eye research and how the intersections and differences among self-study, autoethnography, and narrative inquiry. Because as we started looking for the presence of self-study in those 6 fields, we found a pretty glaring absence in almost all of them. And so what we ended up doing was identifying the presence of narrative eye research and the potential for self-study to be presented in those fields and to be conducted in those fields. So narrative inquiry and autoethnography has a presence in each practice of care, but some more than others. Nursing, social work, counseling have long histories of narrative eye research. Most of that tends to be autoethnography. Narrative inquiry is widely conducted in those areas, but very little of it is from the eye perspective. They're writing narrative inquiry of others. Medical education and physical education are emerging. In fact, I guess the next one, Ledbetter and colleagues just published an article in the European Journal of Dental Education on self-study as a methodology in dental educator identity learning. So I was very encouraged to see that piece come across my Google Scholar page. Nursing has had the longest presence of self-study research, starting with Drebdal et al. In 2002, and there's a couple of pieces in that time frame, 2002 and 2003. There was a dead period for a while, and then self-study has picked up in the last 4 or 5 years in nursing education. Although when I say picked up, we're talking 4 or 5 pieces. Medical education has been very adverse, and there was a lot written about autoethnography, narrative inquiry research, and the hesitance of doing that because there's a long positivistic tradition in medical education that's been hard to break past. Although there's been pushes within medical education to conduct narrative inquiry research. Clandinin and some of her colleagues wrote several pieces a few years ago encouraging the use of narrative research and narrative eye research for medical students and doctors to look at their identities and develop identities as medical practitioners. But there really has not been much of a movement in that field. Physical therapy is a lot like medical education. It's very quantitative, very positivistic, and so there's been a lot of, they're very adverse to moving into autoethnography, narrative inquiry. But occupational therapy, the very related fields of occupational therapy has been very receptive to those. One thing we found was that when self-study was present in a practice of care, that it normally emerged from transdisciplinary self-study groups. So Drebdal and her colleagues, that was a transdisciplinary group with a few nursing educators and other people from different fields outside of nursing education. I believe there was one teacher educator in there. Karen Ragunadin did a piece recently with a teacher educator did some piece recently with some nursing educators. So you're seeing some of that research. We didn't want to delve too deeply into the transdisciplinary nature of self-study because there's a later chapter in the handbook by Anastasia Samaras and Kathleen Fedhouse Morgan that looks at transdisciplinary self-study. So we tried to create our boundaries from not stepping on some toes of other people, but also trying to set the stage for what they're writing about. And so questions that we considered toward the end of the chapter are we limiting the reach of self-study by, with it being so westernized, with, for 4 or 5 years, we had Spanish abstracts on the journal, but that's been removed in the last year or two. What impact did that have? Tom Russell edited a book that turned a lot of chapters, or a lot of STE articles into chapters written in Spanish. What impact did that have? Are we encouraging others to write coming from other languages into English? This is a question posed by a few. Does the name matter? And we talk about that. Does self-study of teacher education practices limit ourselves? Does it limit others from working inside of the methodology? Or are we more open when we say something like self-study of professional practices? Something that we noted that Anastasia and Kathleen, and I know Karen Ragunadin and a few others have written about was the fact that if we're wanting to push the envelope of self-study, get it out there for others to use, we need to start doing some more campus and profession-wide exploration. We need to be doing more communities of learning communities, communities of practice, working with colleagues outside of our areas, getting some groups together and teaching them self-studies and working with them to learn self-study so they can start conducting the work in their own fields. One thing I will say, we were very disappointed in the fact that the last ARA was canceled because we had used this chapter with Mandy as a jumping off point for a symposia. And it was very encouraging, the feedback we got from people who were very interested in participating. We actually brought in people that were doing counseling education. So that's been a new field that started doing self-study recently. Emergency management, we have somebody that was working for FEMA conducting self-study and wanting to teach her colleagues how to do self-study research. So there's places where self-study are growing. It's whether or not it's very present in the field as to date. So I'll leave that there. I think we have plenty of time for questions.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Brandon, and to you and Angela, of course. Yeah, I posed a big question for you, and you certainly rose to the occasion in making some very brave answers as well, in helping us to see as a community how we're reflected through the kinds of work that we publish and where we need to go. And I think, you know, for me, you really highlight that idea of standing on a threshold of opportunity. We are well established within our particular communities. We are well known as a self-study methodology, but where can we take this work? And your questions posing about that idea of how do we call ourselves, where do we reach out to, is really something as a group we can be discussing, and also perhaps something that we want to discuss here. So thank you again, huge virtual claps for the presentation. And I think it's really wonderful the ways in which these chapters have come together. And as Stephanie has made a comment about, you know, they naturally build on each other and give each other strength. So we really appreciate being able to hear each other's chapters today. And we hope that it's given you some opportunities to think more deeply, or to think differently maybe about self-study as well. Now, please know that this is not all of the chapters in the section. We can't present all of the chapters in one presentation. There is another chapter around self-study and knowledge that Aline Van Usher and I have authored, and Aline's prepared a video that will be available on the ESTEP website, and we'll advertise that a little bit more. And there is the other chapter around policy that came from Renee Clift and colleagues in Arizona. So there's a huge amount to dive into, and this is only section 1. But let me just hand over now, because there's time for questions, which we're really happy about, questions and comments. And so Julian or Laura, is there something here that you've seen that you'd like to kick off from, or shall we just open up generally?
So we have a few questions that came through the chat. I'm wondering that if the early questions might have been answered by later presentations. So let's take a moment and see if there's anyone on the call who would like to just offer a question out to the group. Okay, while you're putting your questions together, I'll throw one out. A question came in through a private chat to me, asking if we could kind of point to the differences between autoethnography and self-study.
I'm willing to talk about that.
Great.
So Marilyn and I talked about what we call intimate scholarship. And we see autoethnography, certain kinds of narrative inquiry, certain kinds of narrative research, some forms of action research as intimate scholarship. And they share common characteristics of openness, vulnerability, relationship, etc. And so to me, one of the differences between autoethnography and self-study is that if you want to see autoethnography as self-study, you look at Monica Taylor and Leslie Koya's work. But the difference is that the focus in, as it was originally conceptualized, the focus in autoethnography is applying theory directly to an interpretation of experience and make a living account of research findings by pairing them with your own personal experience. And if you look at Ellis's and Boscher's work, that's what they were doing. So I don't know what other people would say. That's my understanding.
Thanks, Stephanie. Do you have another one, Laura? I've got one here too.
Oh, go ahead.
Well, actually, there's a question that goes back to Dawn's group as well, and that Stephanie had picked up, and I think it's a really important and interesting one, and maybe somebody from Dawn's team can start our talk about it, about the task of legitimizing and some of the tensions that we experience between the traditional expectations of the academy and how we see ourselves and the work of self-study researchers. And I know that was addressed in it's addressed in a lot of the chapters, but Dawn or Linda, do you want to take that one up?
Yeah, I'll take that one. One of the things that we did, we actually did some quantitative inquiry and we counted the number of references that people used, citations across the 12 CASEL conferences. And we plotted them. You can look in the chapter and see the graph, in a steady increase across time that also seemed to be correlated with the pressure we were getting as CASEL editors to be more legitimate in order for people to be able to count. That you couldn't get your institution to pay out the money. And this kind of goes back to that Tom Russell point about the difference between the US and Canada. And unfortunately, I think the US has affected a whole lot more higher institutions across the world than Canada has, so that we were getting this from Australia and New Zealand and other places too. But in order to count and in order to get paid for going to the CASEL, which can be pretty expensive if you're coming from the other side of the world, your institution needed some more evidence that this wasn't just summer camp for adults. Now, it is just summer camp for adults, but we had to make it look like it was more legitimate. That was one thing. And the other thing was we were getting feedback from people going up for tenure. A whole lot of people that you think of now as kind of leaders in self-study were untenured people in hostile environments back in the 90s. And to get tenure or to get promotion past tenure, you needed to be legitimate. You had to have a, you couldn't just get published. It had to show that you'd worked hard to get published, that it was rigorous. And so as the number of citations went up across time, the percentage of acceptance, the acceptance rate went down. And so now it's more at about a 50% acceptance rate, which looks good to people that are looking for rigor. Oh, they're not just accepting everything. And what we want to leave people with is, okay, now what? You know, we've kind of gotten legitimated. People have gotten tenure and promotion. People can get paid to go to the CASEL. But what are the consequences of that for people being able to bring fresh ideas that haven't been fleshed out yet and get feedback and get them to maybe take some completely new line that you don't have very many citations for, to try something besides just doing a research method that looks like it would fit into an AERA review form, and do something with arts or do something completely different. So these are questions that we're going to have to keep on discussing.
I think that's such important points around the exploratory nature of the CASEL and the ways in which kind of the demands about what research should look like from an institution to get there that clash with each other too. So, you know, that it's really, really important aspect for the community in terms of those pressures. Thanks so much, Linda. There's a question here that I'm wondering if that relates well to Cheryl and Gail's chapter around the Fenstermacher and Richardson remarks regarding practical argumentation. So there was a question from Luis Sanchez Neto there. Yes. Cheryl, is that something you would like to take up? Or?
Sure, I can. You know, Fenstermacher's article was an epistemological article. And I think we're pretty we feel that self-study, also narrative inquiry, are ontological enterprises. And so, you know, when you put a misfit together, you get a misfit of an answer. And so that is, you know, I think that's what we would have. I could remember at an AERA presentation, and I went with Jean Clendon into Fenstermacher and Richardson's presentation. And it was so blocked into the argumentation that there was no space for experience, right? Because argumentation was driving the ship. And so I think that particular time that really kind of congealed for me, I think, that the Fenstermacher's work was like driven. The front door wasn't experience. The front door was argumentation. And that's how it was thought of. I did want to add something that I think in 2005, that was a huge marker year when that handbook of teacher education came out, edited by Marilyn Cochran-Smith and Zeichner. And they never included any self-study. They never included any portfolio work, and they never included any foreign non-American authors. And it was a real slap in the face for the whole community. So that's always been one of my things of working in ARA. I mean, SDEP is one of the biggest. And then we've got Portfolio Group that is pretty good, big. Lives of Teachers, Narrative Inquiry. I have no idea why those groups haven't got some political traction and saying, you know, we're more than the rest of you. Like some of the SIGs are bigger than the divisions, right? But we've never used that. And I'm not talking about going and stomping in with army boots or anything, but asserting ourselves. We're here. We are disappointed in that, right? And also that gets back to Brandon's point about everything being American or Canadian or Australian. Well, that really helps to really narrow the field, because then we don't have the Australians and we don't have the Canadians, we just have all American. And I think that was a real marker point. And it's a real wound. I hear that all over the world. Still, it was a wounding of the teacher educators around the world.
Thank you so much, Cheryl. Laura, do you have another one there?
Those are all the questions that I have. If there are no more questions, we can start to wrap up. But I do want to give kind of a last call for questions.
Yeah. Maybe chapter authors, feel free to ask questions of each other now that you have this opportunity to be able to see these presentations too. As I said, this is great for us as well. And I notice here from the Zoom, there's lots of members of our self-study community. And just to acknowledge you too, it's fantastic to see this as a community event and also a reaching out event, the very kinds of things that Brandon has been talking about from his chapter in terms of where we reach out to and how we do that and what kinds of connections that we make with our work.
This is also a good opportunity for people to make comments of their perspectives on things as well, now that we've gone through the formal Q&A.
Perhaps before we do that real quick, because I want to make sure we catch people before maybe they have other appointments or have to go for some reason. But I want to announce who the winner is of our book drawing. So excited. We'll see. All right, it is Zachary Ramsey. So we're so excited for him from University of New Mexico. So congratulations, and we'll be emailing you the details. And if you didn't win, don't worry about it, because there are, sorry about my dog, there are far more opportunities in the webinars to come. So congratulations, Zachary.
Thanks, Eliza. And let's take this opportunity to remind people about the journal, Studying Teacher Education. Julie and I would be keen to hear from you if you're thinking about putting in a paper, especially now that we've seen what the particular groups who have been submitting. Maybe you're outside of one of those groups and you're interested to explore what self-study could look like. So please have a look at the journal website and talk to us about your interests in self-study, as well as other members of the community who are here today.
And I will just take a moment to mention a few things, because I do know some folks need to go. Our next section or session of the webinar series, part 2, is coming up on November 12th. We're sticking with Thursdays all the way through the next 6 months. So Join us on November 12th for part 2, which is all about self-study methods and methodologies. If you've already registered, you'll get an email from me 24 hours before, just like you did today, with the link to join us and a new set of presenters.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Laura and Eliza. You've done a fantastic job of getting us started, and we're all looking forward to the whole series. And you see, this is a brilliant way of being able to take self-study research out into the community and to have this interaction, which I think is really vital in these days. So thanks to our presenters. You did a fabulous job, and let's hope you can all access a copy of the handbook in your libraries. If not, demand that your libraries get one if you can. Thanks. So I think that's all. Julian, did you want to say any words as we finish up?
Well, thank you very much, everyone. But we do have 10 minutes as an opportunity for people to offer their own comments or perspectives on the issues that have been raised by the authors.